without justice, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you who are listening this program. Let's say this emission. It's the first web stream of No Peace Without Justice beyond COVID-19. It's a series that we want to implement every week to discuss and to speak on issue related, of course, not only to the pandemic of the COVID-19, but also of the various theater in which No Peace Without Justice is particularly involved, and that are still are big problem despite this enormous problem represented by this coronavirus. In this time where everyone eyes are rightly focused on the COVID-19 emergency, we are starting today this weekly broadcast dealing with human rights and democracy beyond this pandemic to shed a light on important issue of our time and on important issues that still are very crucial around the world. This specific in this specific day, we wanted to speak about the Yemen war in the 5th anniversary that was yesterday of the starting of the conflict 5 years ago, March 26. And we are honored to have with us four valuable speakers. There are all experts of the Yemen war and of the Gulf region, an important aspect given the fact that this war reflects complex regional dynamic we are about to explore together with them. And so I introduce the four speakers of today, and I'm very pleased and I thank you very much on behalf of No Peace Without Justice to have accepted our invitation. Osama Al-Faki is a Sana-based Yemen human rights researcher and also advocacy director of Matana, which he joined in 2015. Cinzia Bianco is a EFCR fellow and expert of Europe and the Gulf area. Laura Silvia Battaglia is an independent journalist specialized on Yemen, working also for the radio, for the Italian radio TV. And Farian Sabahi is a scholar and independent journalist specialized on Yemen. And I want to welcome you, all of you, and I wanted to start with Osama. Could you tell us about coming from being in Sana directly? Could you tell us about the everyday work of your organization and generally speaking, what's going on in the region, in Yemen, also having heard the news of today's concerning the pandemic of COVID-19 in your country too, of course. Please.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be with you today. My heart goes to all of you in this hard time, and I hope that this hard time ends very soon. Muwatana was established in 2013, and the way that we work on a daily basis is to document the violations committed by all parties to the conflict in Yemen, violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, committed by all parties to the conflict using the investigative research methodology. The situation in Yemen generally, if we want to date the beginning of the armed conflict that is ongoing in Yemen, the war didn't start in March 2015. It started before that. In September 2014, the Ansar Allah armed group Houthis took over the capital Sana'a by force. Since then, we can say that the armed conflict started. What happened in March 2015 was the escalation of the armed conflict. It was a turning point for the whole situation in Yemen, which make it more complicated and more hard for all the people in the country. all parties to the conflict have committed violations, grave violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And the civilians have suffered a lot from different forms and patterns of human rights violations, including the Saudi UAE-led coalition airstrikes, the ground attacks between the Houthis and the coalition forces or the armed groups that are loyal or belong to the internationally recognized government, the enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention, torture, denial of humanitarian access. And this behavior of all parties to the conflict have resulted in what we see today as announced by the United Nations, the worst humanitarian crisis. It's a man-made humanitarian crisis, and all parties to the conflict have involved in making this situation. On March 18, Muwatana for Human Rights and Physicians for Human Rights released a report that documents 120 attacks on medical facilities and healthcare personnel. And in this report, these violations were committed by Ansarullah armed group Houthis, the Saudi UAE-led coalition, and also the armed groups and the forces of the internationally recognized government. And given the fact that the Yemen has collapsed healthcare system, and with all the news and the reports about the pandemic of COVID-19, it becomes very hard to anticipate the future and how people would deal with this pandemic if it spreads in Yemen. It would be a huge catastrophe, given that we are already the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. It would be much more difficult, and there are panic and fear in the street, and it's very concerning for people to stay at home, for instance. And not to go to work, especially those who depend on their to get their income on a daily basis. It will be very hard and catastrophic for them to stay at home and while dealing with the COVID-19, given the fact that the salaries for the public servants have not been paid since 2016, and people are not paid regularly, and it makes it very hard for all the people, and very concerning. Since we are talking about March 2015, the number of like Muwatana has documented more than 500 airstrikes that targeted civilians and civilian objects that resulted also in killing more than 3,000 people and injuring more than 2,000 civilians.
Thank you. Thank you for this first intervention. And of course, the situation is particularly tough. And I can imagine the effort that your organization and yourself are putting in this to face the situation. Let me ask now to Cinzia Bianco what is her feeling about the situation. What is her let's say, impression on of the impact that can have this new phenomenon on the area, and in particular in countries that suffer so heavily of the situation of the war in this recent year.
Thank you very much. I mean, we have been following at the European Council on Foreign Relations not only the war in Yemen, but also the likely impact that the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic could have on the country, and especially as we look specifically at the political and military dynamics in the country itself. How could those change? So we have seen that the officially recognized government of Abd Mansour al-Hadi and his backers in Saudi Arabia have basically accepted the invitation of the United Nations to to call for a ceasefire in Yemen, given the impending potential humanitarian catastrophe that could happen with the virus. We also have seen that one of the senior people in the Houthi movement has expressed appreciation that this idea can be implemented. But we are very, very wary whether this ceasefire will actually be implemented and whether it will hold, because the reality on the ground from a military point of view is that we have seen a relentless escalation in the first months of 2020. We were looking at, with some hopes, at a number of diplomatic trucks at the end of 2019, for instance, those hosted in Oman that were basically putting together the Saudis and the Houthis talking directly to one another in what had seemed to have some hope for progress, especially on the political level. And we had also seen even more secret talks at the military to military level, whereby both sides were committing to small confidence building measures. This was the end of 2019, and then already in the first month of 2020, in January, we could see that things were deteriorating, that the confidence building measures were not working, that they were not reciprocated, and incident after incident, we are now back to a situation where I would say we were a year ago and even before that. So the reality on that front is that, for instance, the Houthis are involved into an offensive on the in the Marib province, which is a relatively strategic province for the opposing side. And the Saudi-led coalition, the Saudi planes, are back to bombing. So we're basically back to square one, and no closer to a solution after 5 years of war. On the contrary, we see that now Houthis have begun again not only missile attacks but also drone attacks towards the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia itself. So even Saudi Arabia is not safer than it was 5 years ago at all. This tells us a number of gives us a number of indications. And this also gives us the context to why in Riyadh many more people are eager to find a solution to stop this war, but they are in a catch-22, self-made and self-created by themselves, whereby they engaged into this military activity without basically a sound strategy or an exit strategy at all. And on the opposite front, we have also seen very worrying signs because, again, the Saudis themselves had brokered an agreement called the Riyadh Agreement that was trying to basically pierce back together this coalition whereby the Hadi government and the forces on the south, the Southern Transitional Council, were basically at loggerheads and physically and literally attacking one another. So not so much of a coalition. And then the Saudis tried to broker an agreement between these two sides, and they thought they had succeeded with the Riyadh Agreement. But the reality on the ground, again, this past few weeks, is that we see again tit for tat and clashes in the south around Aden, but also beyond that. So this track is also collapsing very much. And there is an escalation simmering below the ground. In all of that, the role of the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, is absolutely crucial because they are the most important supporters of the Southern Transitional Council, which can be actually called something akin to a proxy for the UAE. And they have more militias in the south that have such a strong direct link to the UAE itself. So they are a party to this war, very much so. And although they have withdrawn basically most of their troops on the ground, these links to the parties in the south are so strong that they will continue in the upcoming future. And therefore, there is a lot to say about how Abu Dhabi is trying to handling politically the crisis, especially the one between the south and the north of Yemen, and what is the end game of the UAE in the whole situation.
Thank you. Thank you to this first intervention. I now turn to Farian, also a person that knows perfectly the situation on the ground. What's happened with the most vulnerable group, like children or other minority or other groups that are the most vulnerable in this context of the context of the war, and also now in the context of the pandemic phenomenon?
Thank you, Gianfranco, for your kind invitation. More than 100,000 Yemenis have been killed so far in these 5 years of war, according to a report published today by UNHCR. 24 million Yemenis need assistance, meaning food and medicine, and 3.5 million have been displaced. So far, Yemen's broken healthcare system has not recorded a case of coronavirus, but aid groups have warned that when and if it does, the impact will be catastrophic in a country already regarded as facing the worst humanitarian crisis. For this reason, fearing the coronavirus epidemic, schools and universities have been closed in Yemen, but people still celebrate weddings. When and if coronavirus will arrive in Yemen, it will probably decimate an already exhausted population. In Yemen, the diffusion of the virus will be favored by the sociological profile of the country, meaning the large families, the large family structure, as well as life in the markets. Moreover, the diffusion of the virus will be favored by the lack of water sanitation and the fact that in these 5 years of war, hospitals have been bombed by the Saudi-led coalition. Now, I think that the coronavirus will offer an opportunity to stop the war, and I will try to explain why. Yesterday, on the 5th anniversary of war, Saudi Arabia, the Yemeni government and the rebels all welcomed the appeal from UN Secretary General Guterres, who this week called for an immediate global ceasefire to help avert disaster for vulnerable people in conflict zones. As mentioned a short while ago by Cinzia Bianco, the Yemeni conflict has been punctuated by failed agreements, and negotiating a pause could be very difficult. So far, none of the parties to the conflict spelled out any mechanism for the process. The government of Yemen said in a statement that it welcomes the call of the UN chief for a ceasefire in the face of coronavirus. The Saudi-led coalition also backed the initiative, saying, "We support the Yemeni government's decision to accept the UN's call for a ceasefire." And the Houthis also welcomed Gutierrez' call to win back fighting. Mehdi al-Mashat, head of the Houthis political wing, expressed the rebels' total readiness to be open to all efforts and initiatives in the context of a full and real ceasefire. Martin Griffith, UN Special Envoy to Yemen, called for an urgent meeting of all sides to discuss the implementation of the ceasefire. And he urged the warring parties to put their words into action. Engaged in the coronavirus epidemic, the EU is obviously silent. However, the Yemeni crisis is also Europe's responsibility, and we talked about it extensively with Rula Jebreal in January 2019 at the European Parliament. Now, the coronavirus epidemic is offering a window of opportunity to stop the war in Yemen, also because of the collapse of oil prices, which are putting a stress on the economy of Saudi Arabia, which is already burdened by the enormous amount of financial resources needed to support the war in Yemen. Now, Saudi Arabia is ready to discuss, probably ready to discuss the end of the war in Yemen, because oil prices are decreasing and money in Saudi Arabia is needed to support projects. projects within Saudi Arabia and projects which are needed to respond to the requests of the Saudi youth. At the same time, we have noted a commitment of the Emirates to gradually disengage in the military activities in Yemen, and all these are a window of opportunity. And it's important to take this window of opportunity now, because if the war goes on, it will be more and more difficult to keep also the country together. An unintended nefarious consequence of the continuation of the war is that the war could bring a further deepening of the divide between the North and the South. And this is a reality. So it's important to take these windows of opportunity now before coronavirus takes place in Yemen. And we hope that the blockade of part of Yemen will be an obstacle to the epidemic, which is touching so much Europe at the moment. And as you mentioned, if children are the most touched, and children and women, because all reforms which were supposed to take place in Yemen after the Yemeni Spring were blocked by the war, and the lack of medicines and food is one of the major problems in the country. And the bringing also aid in the country is extremely difficult. Every time I give a talk on Yemen, people ask me, how can we help the people of Yemen? And the problem is the blockade of north is so hard to bring stuff within the north of Yemen. And that's a major issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now I turn to Laura. We are speaking since many weeks, more and more often we speak that we are like in a war. Even today in Italy, we have spoken about a war with almost 1,000 people that have died today from coronavirus. But of course, we are facing here a war, a real war. So what is your feeling also semantically on this, the use of the term war compared to the situation and having yourself experience on the field in this particular country? Please.
Yes, thanks a lot, and hi to everyone who is listening to us and watching us. As a reporter covering war since 15 years, starting from Lebanon and arriving now to Yemen, where I was 3 times doing 3 trips. Well, I can say that we should be very, very aware from the rhetoric of the war, using the word war. When we talk about a pandemic, we don't say that an earthquake is a war. We don't say that a pandemic is a war. The consequences, the destruction, the psychological consequences on people and workers, and even on families, is comparable to war. But unfortunately, war is more, and is much more than what we see actually now in our countries, where we have at least adequate healthcare as much as possible to help people. One my concern, and I think it's not only my concern, I can say it's a concern that I have in common with other war reporters and also with other refugees from Syria, refugees from Yemen, refugees from Iraq that live here in Europe and in US, or in countries where at least we have a good healthcare and we have freedom of speech and freedom of movement, is that when we use too much the rhetoric of the war, a part of the consequences on our government and on the social perception of this situation, one of the consequences could be minimizing completely conflict. There are still in place since 9 years, like in Syria, and since 5 years, like in Yemen, And all this conflict were already unreported or minimized or not follow, starting from the media and arriving to the diplomacy in all over the world, could be minimized much more than before. We have already in Yemen people dying from any sort of violence, any sort of diseases. I just want to mention cholera, which was the worst one who hit Yemen, the population of Yemen. But we can also mention the dengue. We can also mention malaria. And we can also mention malnutrition, who is one of the causes that maybe if COVID-19 will come to Yemen, we will kill a lot of people, women and children as well. There's a paradox in all this story. That Yemen, because of its isolation, is the only country that doesn't have one case at the moment of one people positive. Is the only country that doesn't have anybody who is affected by the virus. And at the same time, there's, this lucky at the moment, of course, is the curse of Yemen, because people can't go out, can't move since 5 years. And it's worse than in other countries. If we can talk about the Syrian conflict, at least Syria has different borders and people escaped very, very easily. In Yemen, it wasn't possible and still not possible. We have so many millions of people trapped in this terrible scenario. But there is another concern, a concrete concern about if COVID-19 will arrive to Yemen. Just want to mention the fact that yesterday I talked with Sama Ulaki, one of the doctors who worked in 2019 extensively in Yemen. And there is a case reported about a man who arrived in a hospital in Aden after a trip from Egypt. And he said to the doctors, I don't feel well, maybe I have the flu. And then doctors started to think about the possibility was positive to coronavirus. So they gave him, they asked him to wait inside the hospital, and they said in a very clear and explicit way, so all the people around could listen to, maybe you have the COVID-19. What happened is that the man was about to be lynched by the people there, and was kicked out from hospital. And all the nurses and doctors, they escaped literally when they heard about the possibility that he had COVID-19. After that, the organization, International Organization for Health, came and gave him a test. And after one day, we knew that he wasn't positive. It's good, he doesn't have COVID-19. So this episode raises a lot of concerns about this society is already a broken society. We have a society where there are three classes. There are even the Muhammadin, so people that don't have nothing, they are not considered inside the society. They are so poor, and they are the people that are suffering most during the war because they don't have anything. They don't have even tents. Most of them are the displaced inside the country during the war. What will happen if COVID-19 will come in a society that's already broken from inside, from different people that can't have adequate health care, where the divide among the very few who have already money and they can profit because they are the lordlords inside the country from all the money they gain, and how could be that divide between the few of them and the most of the population? This is a very big concern. And if we had also another topic, how is the healthcare in Yemen? How are the hospitals at the moment? What do they have to help people inside the country? We still see that there's no insulin for people who have problems. We see that there are no antibiotics. It is very, very difficult in the south and more in the north because of the blockade. So this could be really catastrophic, and of course, no one's want that. So that's the reason why a possible ceasefire and an agreement, at least among the different parties of the war, should be done as soon as possible.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, and you're perfectly right. I should like to come back to all of you for a quick second round of intervention. And you have mentioned, of course, the foreign countries who are directly involved in the Yemeni war. We know very well the role that played Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, but other actors are also involved, like Europe in a way. And we are particularly interested in knowing, in listening you now, starting from Osama, for a couple of reflections. First, the role of the foreign countries in Yemen, and second, what do you expect? What will be your way out solution for the crisis in Yemen? Please, Osama.
The international community has been involved in this armed conflict, particularly the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and some other European countries. They have been involved in this armed conflict through supporting Saudi UAE-led coalition, either logistically or through providing or selling arms to coalition members. And also they have been involved in not supporting yet the efforts of accountability and the efforts of to ensure accountability and justice for the victims in Yemen, the victims of violations committed by all parties to the conflict. And I expect that in the coming period, and given this moment that the parties to the conflict have welcomed the ceasefire, I would call the international community, particularly the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the other European countries to stop the arms sales to the coalition and to support fruitfully the efforts of accountability committed, the accountability and also to support justice for all victims of human rights violations in Yemen. And to be particular, I would call the UN Human Rights Council to support a group of eminent experts and through renewing their mandate, and also to strengthen their mandate to include the collect and preserve evidence for all violations committed by all parties to the conflict and related crimes.
Thank you. Cinzia?
So on the question that what external players can do, I think that from our point of view, we are working on first taking a step back. How can, in specifically European players, get leverage over the regional players, especially who are involved in the conflict and in the war? Because the reality, and we have been doing a lot of work on that at the European Council on Foreign Relations, is that Europeans don't have as much leverage as they would want to have and as they should have in order to really influence the behavior of regional actors, especially on a dossier that seems to be very, very high on the priority for all those involved, including Saudi Arabia, of course, but also the UAE and Iran. So we're looking at, I think, a very delicate situation where Europeans cannot really do much beyond what Osama has already suggested, other than trying to increase their own leverage, which cannot be done if not by being more proactive and by, for instance, trying to be the geopolitical Europe that the European Commission has been talking about since their new mandate this year.
Exactly, exactly. Thank you. Faria, which is your
Yes.
point of view?
Yeah, the Yemeni war is partly Europe's responsibility. Europe has been playing a very, very dangerous game in Yemen because war is the perfect arena for militia and for jihadists. One of the main issues that the European Union has been one of the largest humanitarian donors, but at the same time, the European countries have fueled the war by selling arms to the Saudi-led coalition. Besides Europe, of course, there are the US, there's Russia, there's Iran. They also sold a huge amount of money to Yemen, to Saudi Arabia, to the different forces in the war. But when it comes to the European Union has been using taxpayers' money to help Yemenis. And the point is that if the European Union and the US were not selling arms, were not giving money to buy arms to those who have been bombing Yemen for 5 years, Yemenis won't have needed our help. So the control of Yemen is crucial from the strategic point of view, but money is an important key to understand the war. Money explains the lack of political will by the European Union to stop the war. In a way, almost all European countries do have a stake in the war. Simply said, the European Union, European countries had no economic convenience in stopping the war.
Yes, this is something tough, but I'm sure realistic. Laura, your point of view?
I'm afraid to agree with what Farian just said. We are seeing, for example, in Italy, actually, that all the activities of the production chain were shut down except agriculture, and of course, except also companies to sell arms and bombs. And so I don't think, honestly, that in this moment where European countries are very concerned about their budget, they will go to cut the production chain of the bombs or arms. This is, of course, something that doesn't work very much with the idea and with the effort at the international level and at diplomatic level to push for stopping the war and push for a ceasefire. Is a usual double standard that we apply always to too many factors. From another point of view, I just want to stress instead the fact that we need as many witnesses we can in this war. The country and the people working in the country as journalists or activists like Osama, they face a lot of problems because of the internal militias and the militarization of the society. But now they are really our only sources from there. Is 6 months that the central government of Mansour Hadi doesn't release any visa to journalists that want to go legally inside the country. And this raised a market of people that are trying to get journalists illegally into Yemen, asking each one of us $7,500 per person to be smuggled from one of the borders. Obviously, it's the only one where it's possible to do, and get into Yemen from the south to the north. Those groups are the same, that they use the money of the journalists. They want to denounce what's happening in the war, and they want to stress out the idea to stop the war, to buy weapons. So apart from the question that we ask ourselves, if it's worth it, and for me it's not, but we have also to say what's happening right now. It's not possible to have witnesses in this country because there's a lot of business outside the country and inside the country.
Thank you for all of you. I think, and I'm very proud that No Peace Without Justice, as you know, lead campaign since years to 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 give evidence to what you have said, to give evidence to the fact that we cannot, on one side, speak about human rights, democracy, etc., and on the other side, sell arms to those who are involved in theater, war theater like this, and in which civilian entire population are suffering so much. And this is a crucial one that we have intended to start this series of web stream discussion exactly on Yemen, because we feel that this real it is a humanitarian catastrophe and a humanitarian crisis of the biggest importance, and we want to keep the attention despite everything on this situation. Thank you very much to all of you. I hope that this program could be could be seen also not directly, but also because it remain in the web sphere, and I hope that we can soon having the occasion of meet once again in person, this time to continue to pressure for to give the importance that needs to this situation in Yemen. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening and see you soon. Bye bye.